Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, coming at you live to talk about the 2011 live-action movie version of Ousama Game, coming right off the coattails of the anime, which was horrible. you know, I was highly, highly curious to want to check out this live-action film, and I didn't actually know it was 6 years old already. I didn't know it went back that far. But this movie thoroughly redeemed any ill misgivings left over after watching the anime. For my part, it was so much better than the anime. It's kind of like a young adult, like drama, like low budget kind of psychological thriller kind of thing, and it's never really pushing too far like the anime did. I mean, there isn't really much gore. There's a couple of moments where you see some blood and things like that. But the gore is almost entirely excised from this version of it. And there are some interesting character differences, especially if you're coming off the anime and you see how sort of highfalutin things got and embellished things got. And how they were running off the rails with dramatic license and nonsense and absurdity and making up all these reasonings as to why this was all going on. All of that is eschewed. None of that exists in this movie, and it's for the better. It is thoroughly just like I was just watching and my eyes were peeled, and it was sort of over before I knew it, because I found it really intriguing. I mean, you have, sort of not all of the same characters you see appearing in the flashback segments of Ousama Game the animation, which is calling back to the original story that Nobuaki went through. He was the survivor, the sole survivor in the anime series. The story's much different in the movie, but most of, the beats are kind of similar as far as what happens, what transpires in that initial game that in the anime Nobuaki survives. Characters like Naoya, Nami, the girl who in the anime I believe went blind and traversed an entire city while blind, only to drown herself later. Nonsensical things like that in the anime do not happen in this movie. These characters die, but in Nami's case, it's suicide because she's given the choice that she has to send out the message, kind of like what you saw paralleled in the anime with other characters and things. She has to send out a message wishing two people to die and such like that, and she can't go through with it, so she kills herself in this movie version. Now, there's a point where all suspicion is on Nobuaki as being the king, the one who's passing down these orders and rules and things that people have to abide by. And that is because there is this suggestive undercurrent, of sort of traps laid that finger point toward Nobuaki, that make you assume as the viewer and the characters surrounding him that, he's got to be. Here is the proof. These are the pieces of proof we need, photographs, which go back in time to previous schools that encountered a King's Game where entire classes went missing. They see in these old class portraits, there's a Nobuaki, and there's a Nobuaki, and things like that. And this all turns out to be a grand misdirection. It's a trap laid by the genuine king to misdirect, but also to punish, ironically, the king itself, him or herself. And it's kind of mind-blowing. They grab me by the lapels in the opening of the film by calling back on one of my favorite things growing up, Back to the Future. Rather than the blood and the gore and the insanely absurd deaths as we saw in the anime Ousama Game the animation, people are rather erased from existence in this movie. The first two people to die they just evaporate overnight, and then when the class resumes the next day, all but the students in the class themselves have forgotten that these two people existed at all whatsoever. Their desks are gone. The teacher doesn't recognize their names. They call one of their houses, and whoever they're talking to, presumably what once was the kid's parent, has no idea who they're talking about. So rather than these gruesome deaths that just leave bodies everywhere, the physical existence of people evaporates into nothingness, just disappears in this movie. It's so much more creative that way. Now, you do have a couple of people, as I say, die. There is, they have the sequence where the girl jumps out the class window. You don't actually see her jumping out. You see the aftermath once she's hit the ground, and there's some blood, and moments later, her body is gone. There's another point in the story, if you recall, if you've seen the anime, when they're telling the flashback story about the guy and the girl in class who have to have sex. And the boyfriend gets ticked off and wants to kill the guy who did his girlfriend because they went ahead and went through with it. All of that is the same in the movie, but when that boyfriend gets the ruling from the king that, okay, for a day you are now the king and you can pass down one rule against anyone you see fit, and he wishes for the guy who had sex with his girlfriend to die, when that character who has not come to class, he's hiding out in an alleyway hoping Nobuaki and Chiemi will tell him how the guy is, what his mood is, if he's going to try to murder him or not. Suddenly, when that order is passed down by the angry boyfriend, he has to die. You have this character who's hiding in this alleyway start to like hold his neck like he can't breathe. He crawls out into the sidewalk. Some people who are coming by, some office workers and things, stop and they're trying to help him. And within seconds, he disappears, and those people who stopped upright again and move along. They continue their business like that person never existed. They never encountered that person just seconds ago. They've been erased from existence. It is so much more captivating and intriguing along those lines. But as I say, the big, differentiation in how the story is doled out in this film is there's none of this virus. There's none of this, it once was a disease that, went from the human body to computers, and then there was a bug, and all the crazy, absurd, nonsensical explanations they try to pass off in the anime. It is much more reasoned out. And especially if you're going into it with expectations about how the anime played out, the one chief factor you open up with, Nobuaki being the main character and being a carryover survivor from a previous school, all of that's out the window. The main character, the main focused character of this film is Chiemi, not Nobuaki. She has interactions with him, and there is a friendship between them, a rapport. It never really goes beyond the fact that they knew each other in childhood and they've been lifelong friends. You kind of get the hint that maybe there could be something more developed at a later time, but neither one of them is really thinking too deeply about it or anything like that. So the romantic element, it doesn't really exist in the film, for better or worse. But, they are friends and they do interact. But Chiemi is the one who is the spotlight character. We're seeing things from her perspective by and large, her reactions. And Nobuaki is, for the most part, for like the first 3/4 of the film, kind of just there, kind of just an afterthought. When finally people start to find and stumble into the traps, air quotes, of the proof, the portraiture that sees, versions of him in schools past that had suffered this. Then he sort of, becomes more into the focus. But if you expect that it's going to end the same way the anime began, with him being the sole survivor, you're going to be disappointed. That is not what happens at all. And there's even... I was watching this and sort of the scrutinizing part of my brain, the critiquing part of my brain was like, well, wait a minute. If these former schools had suffered the King's Game and entire classes, it made the news, it got in the newspapers, entire classes had been wiped out, had disappeared. But all of the surviving people, the faculty, the teachers, the parents, wouldn't remember those people ever having, existed. How are there still portraits, class portraits in existence that haven't been erased? And there's a reasoning for that. And it's very much as the character of Rhea in the movie, who is very understated as she was in the anime, but not to the embellished absurdity of being lit on fire as you see in the anime and being completely and totally unconcerned or unaffected by it. That doesn't happen in the film. But Rhea is somebody who is figuring some aspects of this out, and they kind of play games with her character a little bit to the point where you assume she could be the king. There is a legitimate king in this movie. We get the answer who it is, how it's all working out, why it is so. It's all answered by the end. It is not the red herring that is set up for all of the class, the small band of survivors by that point in the movie, the three-quarter point in the movie, that assume it is Nobuaki. They are being misdirected. And it's actually Naoya who, sacrifices his life in a sense. He logs in to Nobuaki's email and sends out a message, because once Nami killed herself, Nobuaki was then chosen to have to send a message out to 3 people instead of 2 who were going to be the next to die. And so he basically gets jumped by 3 of the survivors because they found these old portraits which show versions of himself in the past, in these past classes. And rather than question that, they just make the assumption he must be the king, and they try to kill him. But then Naoya logs into his email, sends the message, and takes out those 3 who are about to kill Nobuaki, thus killing Naoya himself as well. And it's really trippy. It's really engrossing and engaging. It isn't tantamount. It isn't paramount. It isn't like an Oscar contender or anything like that. These are all young players. Most of them are actors, singers in Japan and things like that. And the performance aspect of it is passable. It's not anything stellar. But for my part, because they did enough things creatively and differently, people are being erased from existence. They're not just suffering gruesome deaths. It was so much more interesting, and I became so much more invested for that fact. And the whole idea that it all revolves around this particular character, that it does in the end, who turns out to be the king, it is pretty fascinating, because they don't just, leave the movie off hinting at that, and then you never get any sort of, follow-up. The character of Rhea pointedly tells this other character, who is the king, that they are. Maybe, perhaps, unbeknownst to them, they've been the king all along. And the king's game has not only been about making others suffer, but ultimately, it has been to make the king, him or herself, suffer. By putting them constantly, recycledly through time into the same position, give them all these friends, surrounded by all these friends, and make them go to great pains to see them all diminished and erased from their life. So that they're constantly, being psychologically, emotionally impacted over and over and over again. And it's tragic, but at the same time, they do this great Nightmare on Elm Street kind of ending thing where it's a minor misdirect, because for all intents and purposes, all of the characters by the end of the film are seemingly dead. They've all succumbed to the King's Game. But then you end with a somewhat cliched, we're in a new school and there's a new transfer student. They're not showing the face of the transfer student. It's probably the king moving on to a new school, and this is all going to start all over again. But there's this neat little misdirect where the transfer student is not the king. It's an actual legitimate transfer student joining a new school, and when they go and they find their desk, they just happen to be sitting next to the character who has been the king all along. And it does start anew. And it's so much more creative, so much more interesting in how boxed in it is. I mean, for the most part, you're mostly spending time on school grounds and in the classroom. And the desks are disappearing. And it gets to be so absurd looking when there's like only 4 or 5 desks left in the classroom. And the teacher comes in and says, no absences? Okay, let's get started. it doesn't look like a normal classroom anymore. But only the students themselves have any comprehension of the losses of the lives that have been erased from existence. And it's so strange and exhilarating that, like, you don't need the overabundance of gore, you don't need the overabundance of nonsensical absurdity. It is well thought out and well paced, and it never sort of buries the needle on giving you too much information, trying to make sense of things in nonsensical ways. It's very dialed back. And that's kind of why I equated it to being almost low budget, because it is very confined for the most part to the classroom. We do see, we go back to Nobuaki's house, we see his dining room and his bedroom, and Chiemi's there briefly for a time. We see a little bit of Chiemi's room and her house. And apart from those two places, those two set pieces, and the school itself, the classroom, there is a point where, kind of akin to what they do in the anime, Nobuaki and these three other characters, they go to one of the old schools, the oldest one in known record, where this King's Game began, and that's where they're going to try to jump him because they think he is the king. Apart from that, it's a very contained story. There isn't an overabundance of CG or special effects or anything like that. What effects there are when people disappear or their desks disappear, it's either done creatively with camera work, or it's kind of a digital CG evaporation effect. Everything is very subtle and subdued, and it makes it that much more impactful for it. And so I couldn't more highly recommend checking out this movie. If the anime left a bad taste in your mouth, let me tell you something. This is an hour and 20 minutes long. It's an hour and 20 minutes long, a length that will save and preserve any sanity that you lost watching Ousama Game, the animation. And if you don't want to take my word for it, if you don't think you want to sit through it, that's perfectly your objective, your prerogative, whatever like that. It's perfectly fine. You don't have to, by any stretch of the imagination. It might add something to the conversation. If you do, go check it out, and you let me know in the comments below what you thought of it, if you thought it was a waste of time, if you thought it was much better than the anime as I put forth in this video, such like that. But I thought it was leaps and bounds for its, sort of inclusiveness, the very tightly knit, subdued quality to the storytelling, no real crazy, exaltations, no crazy absurdity, it was a very character-driven piece. And while it wasn't, the performances weren't anything super-duper stellar, it was still engrossing enough with the creative twists and turns they applied to the story, and the twists and turns that went against what we had already seen in the anime. So for my part, the movie was pretty damn good. It's actually a movie I could see revisiting, from time to time. It did not disappoint me in the least. And at the end, like I said, you get that little misdirect where you think, oh, the king survived and they're transferring into this new school, but it turns out to be a different student altogether is transferring in, and they just happen to be seated next to the king who's already there. Was like, all right, I see what you did there. So that's in a nutshell my thoughts on the Ousama Game live action 2011 film. It was actually pretty damned enjoyable, especially after watching the horrid anime. I've heard people excusing the anime as this was intended to be a comedy, and you're supposed to laugh at it. It's not supposed to make sense. No, I don't agree with that at all, because there were some really dramatic, heavily weighty moments, emotionally impactful moments that they played seriously. And for the most part, they played everything seriously. They didn't, not to a so bad it's good level. It was just bad. Like, they just made bad decisions, and it wasn't like they were playing on cliches or tropes. A few times they were, and there were times where it was passed off as humorous or just absurd and nonsensical, but when you're watching something like that, you're not supposed to feel frustrated. And when they come in and they put, like, real legitimate heart, an emotional weight to things, but then everything else is scatterbrained and absurd, and nobody's making good decisions, and everyone is stupid, and they can't figure themselves out of a wet paper bag, that is frustrating. It's not entertaining. It's not funny. And so I highly, highly take issue with the fact that Ousama Game the animation, King's Game the animation, the anime, is supposed to have been a comedy. We're supposed to be laughing at it or with the people who created it. I didn't get that impression watching it. And this movie, this live action movie, 6 years precursor, is that much better than any episode, any of those 12 episodes of that anime, in my humble opinion. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. If you watched the movie already, if you've seen it, what you thought of it, if you're going to go check it out based on this recommendation and review, which I do highly recommend you check it out. Again, it's an hour and 20 minutes of your life that will benefit you with a better version of the story if you sat through even just, 5 minutes of the anime. And yeah, I'd love to hear from you. That's pretty much going to be it for me on this. Hope this video finds you well, and I'll catch y'all later.